Well, good evening, everyone. Are we awake? It's a dreary day out there, but it's nice in here, right? All right, so we're going to have to take bets, see who I put to sleep tonight. Let's see if anybody's going to go to sleep. Everybody will get your eyes bright and open. I know this is tough weather. This is tough. 3 days of this, my God. It's a teacher's nightmare when you're trying to teach and you got all the, right? The damp weather, you're trying to fight all that stuff. It's just the way it is. We'll do the best we can to try to keep you awake. You look up on the TV here, some of you folks have been in other classes. This is a picture of Anku's adoptive father. This was the vizier who was the person in charge of the granaries and the measuring the Nile and those kind of things before Joseph. This is most likely the one who trained Joseph in his position. We were sharing that according to archaeologist David Rawl, he believes Anku was actually in history. He is the historical Joseph, the one that we read about in the hieroglyphics and the papyri from the Egyptian era. There's a lot of records being discovered. I spent some time this past week reading another book on the subject and a little bit above my pay grade, but it's amazing what they're finding in various caves and tombs and things. A lot of the things they found have not even been researched yet. They have so much information that has not been looked at. But we can, with great confidence, have great confidence in the Bible and the stories that they tell, because they're finding more and more evidence to confirm their stories. And that's really what we've been trying to hit on as we've been in the book of Acts. We've been in Acts chapter 7 for a few weeks, because what we're doing is, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen, who's the first deacon in the church, he was raised up as a deacon. He is brought before the Sanhedrin, which was the supreme court of the land. I need to move a little closer to you guys. He was the supreme court. He is being tried for blasphemy. They're accusing him of blaspheming against the law of Moses and against the temple. And he stands, thank you, John. He stands before, I just messed this up. He stands before the Sanhedrin. Sorry, my little thing that holds this on has disappeared on me. Well, maybe it's somewhere. I'll just put it in my pocket. I don't know what. Oh, there it is. Thank you, John. We'll just leave it up here for now. I hate microphones, I'm just going to tell you. Me and microphones don't get along. I'm ruining them all the time. I'm going to have to fix that. So be patient with me as I do this, but you can hear me. So Stephen is defending himself, and the way that he defends himself is that he goes over Israel's history that's recorded in the scriptures, as well as recorded in other places in history. But he goes over and he just explains how that when God does something in Israel's life, the Israelites tend to resist it. And we're going through that. So we're just taking the opportunity to kind of go through some of the stories and look at them a little bit more deeply. And before we get into the next section, we've looked at the patriarchs. They're Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're the founders of the Jewish nation, and Abraham is the one that God established a covenant with Abraham to do certain things in his life and in the history of his people. And then we looked at Joseph last week. Next week we're going to look at Moses, and we're going to get into a little bit of the Exodus journey, this parting of the Red Sea, kind of the movie things that we saw a couple weeks ago. But what I thought we'd do tonight is we'd do a little, for some people this might be a little bit of review, but for some people it might be new. And what I want to talk about to begin with is worldview. And the reason why this is important, as we went to the movies a couple weeks ago with a group and we saw the 3 different views that people have of the Exodus journey, one of the things that they don't explain in the movie of why people view the story the way they do. And the reason why people view the stories in the Bible the way they do, one of the big reasons, is something called worldview. Our worldview is the lens or the frame with which we look at life. If you have a picture, we put pictures on the wall, but we draw a frame. We have a frame on them. We frame them. And that frame helps focus your view of what's inside of that picture. Now, I'm not an artist, so if you look at Canada, here, and then you have, the South America and Americas. So you have a picture of the world. How you see the world is framed by something. We call that a worldview. And so I want to start with that tonight, and we're going to end with showing you how the worldview that we have going into the biblical stories will influence what we see in those stories. Oh, mic on? I told you I'm rough on these things. Plus I'm really secretly trying to keep you awake. A worldview filters everything you see in life. And whether you realize it or not, you have one. Every person has one. We interpret the events that happen to us. And the way we interpret them is through our worldview. It's like when you put sunglasses on in the summertime, it colors everything you see. Whatever color your sunglasses, brown or dark black, it filters and it colors everything you see. Your worldview and my worldview interprets what happens to us. We really all are interpreters of Scripture and life. And so we need to understand what that worldview is. A worldview is a set of assumptions. An assumption is something that you believe is true, but have not taken the time to prove is true. You assume it's true. Now, does anybody know what happens when you assume? Don't say it out loud, we're on video. We've all seen The Odd Couple, when you assume, right? Well, assumptions, you have to make certain assumptions in life. You can't function. You can't be every moment of the day trying to analyze everything that comes up in front of you, right? So we make a set of assumptions of things that we generally think are true. But often, and what I find is most people have not taken the time to consider whether their assumptions are really true or not. And when that happens, here's the problem. Everything that we see gets filtered through these set of assumptions. And if we're not careful, we begin to confirm what we see based on our assumptions, but we can often misread what's really happening. And so that's what happens when people come to the Bible. When they filter the Bible through their assumptions, as we'll see in a few moments, it can alter and negatively impact what they're reading. Now, worldview is made of four things and answers four questions. These are on your notes, by the way. And I'm going to basically follow your notes along with mine. But a worldview has basically four parts, like a picture frame. The first is origins. Where we came from. It answers the question of where we came from. So if you picture a picture frame, you got four sides on a picture frame that are going to frame. I told you I'm not an artist, and you believe me, don't you? You're just filtering it through your worldview. In reality, I'm a great artist. Origins, where did we come from? At some time or another, every one of us are going to answer the question for ourselves, what we believe about where we came from. And the answer to that question is going to shape a lot of what you see and when you read things. And even when you go to the movies, every movie writer, every magazine you read is written by somebody who has a worldview. They're interpreting life. I mean, if you look on TV today, and I know none of you watch TV because you're too spiritual, but there's a lot, have you noticed there's a lot of TV shows that are caught up with the power and mutations and where they're getting new power and they're superhuman? Have you ever noticed that? It's part of a worldview. Or UFOs coming and aliens coming down. I mean, we think they're just entertainment, but in reality, have you ever watched a TV show and they begin to spout off things that maybe are obscene or foul, and you wonder, why did they do that? And because my wife and I were like, why did they do that? Now we can't watch it, we turn it off. And it's one of those things, or she says that. And we discuss why did they do that, and this is what I tell my wife when we get to discussing it. They did it because it's part of their worldview. It's how they look at life. They don't even realize they're doing it. They're living out their worldview. And there's a view of origins, where we came from. And then the second question is that of meaning. I like to call it the fall. In Genesis chapter 2, Adam and Eve sinned, and it plunges the world into disease and decay and suffering. And the fall, that's the title I like to give, but it answers meaning and purpose. Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? Why is there pain and suffering? And then the next question is redemption. How do we fix the pain and suffering that we experience? Now I have these all in your notes. And then we have destiny. Where is all this going? Let me give you an example of how worldview plays out. You're sitting at a stop sign down here in Milton. You're minding your own business, you're fiddling with the radio, getting your favorite 70s song on because we know everybody's stuck in the 70s, right? You say, 70s, when was that? But you listen to the radio, your favorite song comes on, and somebody plows in behind you and rams the rear end of your car and totals the back end of it. Now, how do you interpret that event? Somebody might say, well, God had a reason for that. That's a worldview. Because the worldview answers, what went wrong with the earth? Why is there pain and suffering? And people come to me all the time and they'll tell me things like, when certain things happen, they'll say, well, God's doing this and God's doing this. Part of their worldview. They believe that God exists and they believe that God's involved in everything. And the Bible doesn't really teach that, but there are filters interpreting everything. And we have to be careful with our worldview because what we believe about origins, what went wrong with the earth, what is the fix to what went wrong with the earth, and where we're going are going to influence everything we see in life. Okay? Now, I know this is not like shouting stuff, like, we're going to have church tonight and shout, but I will promise you, if you can get a hold of these 4 things, you will begin to, every book you read, every theologian you read, every preacher you hear, you'll be able to have a greater level of discerning where they're coming from. Like I can pick up a book and I can just read through the pages, and in about 5 or 10 minutes I can tell you what their worldview is. Because they're going to reveal it, somewhere along the line they're going to touch on these 4 things. And so when we're going through life, every one of us are trying to figure out where we came from. I have 2 adoptive kids. Both of them were adopted when they were young. And one of the things when we went through the adoption process, the counseling agency took us through and they said, now, at a certain point, your kids, because they don't look like us, so there was an open adoption. They knew they weren't adopted. They could look at me, and you can look at Caleb, and you know that he's adopted. Okay? Now, I'm the better looking of the 2, but that's all right. And they said they're going to ask the question, where did we come from? That is as natural as breathing. And our identity as a human race, where we came from, influences how we live life. That's why today the dominant worldview is Darwinism. Is that we just if everything happened by chance, and we just kind of evolved. And that's a worldview, and that's an answer to where we came from, and it is affecting what we see, and it's affecting how we behave. Because it leads to the next thing. Eventually you're going to ask the question, when you get old enough, you're going to ask the question, why do things hurt? Why do I suffer? Why is there pain in the earth? And then you're going to ask questions like, and this is in your notes, you're going to answer, okay, how do I fulfill my desires? And are there any boundaries to my desires? These are all answered by our worldview. As Ravi Zacharias says in the beginning, in Genesis chapter 2, when we talk about the origin of the species, we're really talking about the autonomy of the species. That in Genesis chapter 2, what really happened when Adam and Eve were created and the devil came into the garden and said, did God really say? And he tempted them to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What he was really challenging them was, do you have the freedom to do whatever you want? Can you be autonomous? Can you do whatever you want, or are there boundaries? See, these are questions that every one of us are going to have to answer, and everybody does answer. And if you sit down with them and ask them the right questions, you will figure out what they believe. So what went wrong with the earth? And then what went wrong is going to be followed by what is the fix? Like, I hate to tell people this sometimes because they look at me with I got 3 heads, but modern psychology is based on Freud, who based his worldview on evolution. Now, I study psychology. I want to know what they're teaching. But I understand the worldview by which they're coming from. Very naturalistic worldview, anti-God. You can't just trust all the psychology that gets thrown on you. You've got to be able to discern it through this filter. Because there's good things in modern psychology and there's bad. How are you going to know which the difference is? Because they have, and Freud had a belief. Freud believed that one of man's problems was religious people. And that we needed to free people from the oppression of religious people and religious systems. And that's why a lot of this stuff that people don't have the history of, don't know, well, why are they doing certain things? Well, because they have a belief in where we came from, what went wrong with the world, and what's the answer? The answer is to get everybody to act autonomously, to get everybody free to do whatever they want. Well, that takes us right back to the beginning in the Garden of Eden, the fall of the devil. Now, am I making any sense here? You know? Or are we okay? You with me? Okay. You make me a little nervous when you get this quiet. Okay? I think somebody back there going, well, I got to get lunch tomorrow. You know, I got to change my tires. You know, go to Walmart, change my tires. You know, I'm thinking of other things. And then where are we going? Where is all this going? You know, I'm not an expert in science, but I've read enough science stuff that the end is heat, death. We all end up in, you know, it all blows up or burns up. Doesn't seem very happy to me, whereas in the Bible, we're headed for a future when heaven comes to earth. Now, that's called a worldview. And if you get a hold of those four things, where we came from, origins, what went wrong, what's the answer, and where are we going, everybody has one. See, when you watch a movie, like years ago when I was the youth pastor here, I mean, this is a long time ago, I brought in a movie clip for our young people from the movie Mission to Mars. Anybody seen it? Mission to Mars? 3 of you? 2 of you? Does anybody know what Mars is? Anybody awake? Well, with Gary Sinise is in it. And it's a movie where the astronauts are going to Mars, and when they get to Mars, they see what looks like a face. In fact, this is actually somewhat scientific. It's based on some science. That there's a thing that looks like a face on the planet, and basically they find this thing and they enter it, and then they find out how everybody got to Earth. So, and they go into this certain room, and then there's like a hologram, and it shows some far out planet out in space somewhere. No, it's actually Mars. It's from Mars, and it shows Earth. Remember, it's been a long time. And then all of a sudden, all these ships leave Mars, okay, and they go to Earth. And then Mars kind of dies. Now, the implication of that is the movie's telling you that at some point, where we came from as human beings, we came from Mars. That's what they're saying. That the Mars aliens seeded the Earth. Anybody heard this in science class?
Yes.
Does anybody know what it's called? Yeah, it's too late, I know, and you're tired. It's called directed panspermia. It's that aliens seeded our planets. Now, we're watching this, because I was bringing this lesson up to the youth, is we're watching this as entertainment. Gary Sinise is the hero, you know, and it's really suspenseful, and they're on this planet, are they going to get back? And, you know, what are the aliens going to look like? But what was really happening was through entertainment, a worldview was being presented. Where did we come from? We came from Mars. At least my in-laws came from Mars. Okay? That answers part of the question. Okay? Something went wrong on Mars. Okay? And they traveled to the Earth to save themselves, I guess. They're to save their posterity. Okay? Well, they don't answer in the movie, but it's going to lead to what ought we ought to do. We ought to look for the Martians, man. Okay? And where's this thing going? That's a worldview. In everything we watch and see, there's a worldview being presented. Everybody is an evangelist for their worldview and their belief system. Okay? We have a biblical worldview. And so, I'm just driving home as we begin to look like, for those that went to the movie a few weeks ago, looking at the archaeology and how people were disagreeing, we're going to learn right now why they disagree. Because they enter with a different worldview, a different frame of the world, and it's coloring and filtering what they see. Now, there are 3 basic worldviews. Just 3. This is really not as complicated as I just made it. Okay? There's 4 basic questions that it answers. Worldview answers where we came from, what went wrong with the earth, why there's pain and suffering, what the fix is, redemption, and where we're going. Those are the 4 questions that a worldview answers. Now, everyone has one of 3 worldviews or a little bit of mixture of the 3. The first is called a naturalistic worldview. You see, you've got the little drawings here on the paper. I decided to be an artist, and I can do it with a computer. But I want you to see something here. And hopefully this will tie together in the end, or we'll all go home and have a good laugh on Pastor Bob trying to make sense of something tonight. This is the universe. Looks like an egg, but it's the universe. Okay? It's a good thing I'm not God, or things really would be messed up. Years ago, I read a scientific book that said the universe has edges. Try to think about that one. Show me. Yeah, show me. So, the universe has edges. So here's the question I ask. The same one you're asking. What's on the other side? Right?
Yeah.
Now stay with me here. Because this is more relevant than we think it is. Let's say, for just sake of argument, that they're right. The universe has edges. This will help you see worldview. There's three basic worldviews. The first one is called naturalism. I also put under there atheism, but it's naturalistic. That the only thing that there is nature. Some people call it secularism. We're seeing this every day in our news and in our culture. The only thing that exists is this. Okay? So what that really is teaching is that the only thing that exists is inside. That looks like an Easter egg, doesn't it? Is inside of the universe. In the created order. Now I'm going to tell you, great minds think about this, and they even have come up with theories now that the universe is expanding and contracting. It really blow your mind. It's amazing how people in a little room somewhere can come up with some really interesting ideas. But I want us to get hold of it because this is not benign stuff. This is being taught in our universities. This is being taught to generations of kids, to your kids. Some of your young kids are going to face these three worldviews. And basically the first one says, inside the universe is all there is. There is nothing outside of here. There's nothing. You get outside of this edge, wherever the edge is, or if it just kind of, like fades out, whatever it does, there's nothing outside of this. This is all there is. That's called naturalism. Okay? You with me? So there's nature in the created order, the universe, everything material, and then outside of that there's nothing. The second one is basically called agnosticism, or it's the agnostic worldview that says there may be something outside of here, right? With a big question mark. The universe is all there is, but there might be something out here. Okay, the first one is atheism, leads to atheism, naturalism, trying to use terms that you would know, that there is no God, there's nothing outside of the universe, the material world is all there is. The second one says, it's called agnosticism, that all we really can know is what's inside of the universe, what's created. If there's something out here, we don't know, we can't know. Now there's two forms of this. According to Ravi Zacharias, is there's hard-boiled agnosticism, says you can't know what's outside of here, and that's what he calls soft-boiled, which is we don't know. We just don't know. So you can't or we don't. But the point being is, all we really can understand is here, what's outside of here, we don't even know it exists, and if it does, we'll never figure it out. Can't be known. With me? Okay. The third one is theism. Theism, from the term theo, God. There's a created order, a universe, and outside of the universe, and penetrating in somehow, which we don't want to get into tonight, I don't want to get too far, that God is present inside of the universe and outside of the universe. Okay? People you meet are going to have one of those three. And what they hold is going to determine what they see in life, and it's going to determine what they see in the Bible. Now, I actually skipped. I went from number 2 to number 4, so I got a typo on the next page. Now, I'm saying all this to say what I'm about to say. Are you ready for the roller coaster ride now? I think we've already been on a roller coaster. I'm tired too. My brain is not functioning on all 8 cylinders. I'm warning you tonight. Our worldview affects, as we said, how we interpret life, what happens to us in the Bible. Okay? Now, you got one of these 3 worldviews, and I don't want you to keep looking at the egg. The scary thing about my drawings is they're going on the internet. And no school of art has discovered me yet and offered me a scholarship. So I'm not going to hold my breath. Now, we've been talking about Joseph and history, and I've been reading a lot of David Rawls' material. And I thought this would be a great time to kind of examine his worldview. Because David Rawls has a certain perspective that we'll particularly see next week when it comes to the Exodus. And I have a fuller account of it in my notes, and I just gave you a partial for yours just to kind of see it. But in the Exodus story, which we're going to end up, if we have time, reading a little bit of that before we leave tonight, here's what happens in Exodus 14. Moses, on the night of the Passover, takes the children of Israel out of Egypt by strong hand when Pharaoh's firstborn son is killed. The firstborn of all Egypt dies if they don't put the blood on the doorpost, according to Exodus chapter 13. And in chapter 14, they're led out. Chapter 13, they're led out. Then they're led to the Red Sea in chapter 14. And the Red Sea is going to open up, and they're going to walk through it. And then after the Israelites get across the Red Sea, the Egyptians are going to try to cross it, and they're going to get wiped out. The whole army is going to be destroyed. Now, where the debate is where exactly did this happen, and what did God do or not do? And the explanations are interesting. I want to give you David Rawls' explanation, and then we want to look at it from the viewpoint of which worldview do you think he holds. He says, so finally, speaking of the Exodus miracle, he says, so finally we come to the second unexplainable miracle. Now he's talking about all the plagues and things that happened in Egypt in the book of Exodus, chapters 1 through 10. All the previous miracles, with the exception of the death of the firstborn, which was the last one before the parting of the Red Sea, have rational explanations. Now that word rational should be a flag. Okay? So we've already narrowed it down to how many worldviews? Of the three, two. We've not, because if you hold the atheistic or naturalistic worldview or the agnostic worldview, you cannot allow for miracles. Everything has to be explained rationally. We have to be able to explain everything naturally. Okay? Now, here's the challenge. I'll just get ahead of myself. Here's the problem that we have. Many people today, theologians, don't believe in miracles. Do you know why? They have either an atheistic or agnostic worldview, and they're reading the Bible, and when they read the Bible, they can't allow for miracles in the interpretation. They have to have a rationalistic explanation. I've mentioned in previous classes, and John, you'll remember, William Barclay. William Barclay, great commentary set, brilliant on history, but he always has a rational answer for every miracle that happens in the Bible. Okay, kind of like Thomas Jefferson did. So let's go read on. He says, they have rational explanations within scientific knowledge and are indeed observable phenomena. In other words, we can see these happening today, particularly in the environment of Northeast Africa. But how do we explain the miracle at the Red Sea? In January 1882, a British officer, Major General Sir Alexander Tulloch, was inspecting the Suez Canal, which is in Egypt, by where all this stuff happened 3,000 years ago. It was which he says recently completed in 1869, when he witnessed a wonder of nature as the 5-foot deep waters of Lake Menzala literally disappeared. An easterly gale came up very rapidly and, at last, was so strong, driving the sand from the dry side into my face, this is the guy speaking in his own testimony, that I had to cease to work. The next morning, the wind having gone down a great deal, I went out onto the canal bank, when to my astonishment I noticed that Lake Menzala on the west side of the canal had disappeared beyond the horizon in that direction, and that the Arabs were walking on the mud where the day before the boats had been floating. When thinking over this extraordinary effect of wind on shallow water, it suddenly flashed upon me that I was witnessing a similar event to that which had taken place between 3,000 to 4,000 years ago at the time of the passage of the so-called Red Sea by Israelites. Rawls continues. Clearly, the only difference between these two accounts, apart from Yahweh's presence, is a description of the walls of water on either side of the Israelites as they crossed the dry bed of the sea. Once again, now here's Rawl, you can accept this scientific explanation. You can regard this aspect of the story as legendary, that is storytelling hyperbole. Whichever explanation you prefer, there can be little doubt that this event was remarkable and rare. For any human there to experience it, such an amazing phenomenon would certainly have been regarded as miraculous. Now, do you see how Rawl is explaining away a miracle? He's trying to explain away a miracle. Now, why is he doing that? Because he admits, he says, though I continue to regard myself as an agnostic, I am convinced that the stories of the Bible are based on real events and personalities.
He was kind of contradicting himself there.
He did, but what he's really showing is that this archaeologist has been pursuing history for 40 years. And the history has led him to believe that the Bible is based in history and that you can trust it. But because of his worldview that he's holding, the one in the middle, the agnostic worldview, which in the beginning of our founding of our nation, it was called deism. That's why I put that down there, to get you acquainted with this. It's the belief that if there's a God out there somewhere, remember I drew the egg here, and if there's a God out here, we can't know who he is, and we certainly cannot allow for him to do things in this earth because we can't explain them. And so what happens is, when somebody has that worldview and they come to the Bible, they have to explain away the supernatural. And folks, people do it all the time because a miracle is not possible. And so everything they see and everything we see, if we're not careful, will begin to confirm our worldview. Now this is where it's going to get very real for us, because I'm going to say some things here that might just ruffle some feathers. All three of these worldviews do this. There's three worldviews. There's a worldview that's naturalistic, says there is no God. That's atheism. When a supernatural event occurs, they're going to have to find a naturalistic explanation, like David Rawl here. This is where look, I've read a ton of David Rawl stuff here in the last 3 or 4 months. He's a brilliant archaeologist. He's just a horrible theologian. That's where I part company with him. I'm saying this explanation, David, is confirmation bias. You are not ready to follow the evidence where it's leading. He can't make that step, even though there's plenty of evidence. Remember, if for some of you who've been here, I started this class by talking about Acts. The book of Acts starts with Jesus presenting evidence of his resurrection. Jesus comes to the disciples and says, stick your hand in my side, see my hands. I was crucified and I was dead, now I'm alive. That's evidence. Doubting Thomas in the Gospels wasn't there when Jesus rose. They pulled him aside and said, hey, look at my side, Thomas. And he presents him with evidence. The Bible presents us with evidence. But the reason why people can't see the evidence that God is presenting is because they're holding two other worldviews. And these worldviews blind us to the evidence right in front of us. David Rawl, it's easy to pick on David Rawl. He's not here. And if David Rawl was here in a debate, he could probably make me look like a fool. At least according to archaeology. I think I could win a debate theologically with him, but archaeologically he'd beat me. He's a little bit smarter than I am. Not much. But he's been brought, I believe the man before he dies is going to come to Christ. I believe he's been inching that way. And you're going to meet people that are inching their way and slowly the evidence. And so we can't beat on people when they don't believe the Bible. We just keep presenting the evidence and the truth and let the Holy Spirit work to get us to see. Because when we come to faith, what's going to happen is we're going to change worldviews. If we're in these other two worldviews, we're going to adopt a theistic worldview. There is a God. He's involved in this earth, and he's outside of whatever there is. That's the God of the Bible. It's called theism. And once you allow for there to be a God, miracles are now possible. This is the reason why there are more miracles in Africa than America. I mean, you know, I've shared the story before. My wife and I went to Africa last year, and we saw a crazy man get healed. The man was crazy. They chained him to a tree every day. The first night, he scared me to death. I'm sitting up in front of the stage. I look out and I make eye contact with this guy. He looks at me and goes, looked like something from The Walking Dead. It scared me. I'm like, whoa. And his brother's holding him with a chain. If he lets go of the chain, Patty's in trouble.
You can outrun her.
Because I can outrun her. After the service, nothing happened in the service first 3 days. It wasn't until the last night of the services at 4 o'clock, before the church service, 4 o'clock, not even in the service. At 4 o'clock, the man came to his right mind. So that night, we're looking for the man in the service. I can't find him. Jay can't find him. We can, well, where is this guy chained to his brother? We're looking for him. Because every night he was there making those weird noises. And at times, his brother just chained him to the tree. Because I guess he got tired of holding him. Well, come to find out, he's right there in front of us. Normal. Talking. Hadn't talked in 4 or 5 years. It's like when I tell people when I got healed. You know, when I went to see my neurologist, folks, I was having epileptic seizures every 28 days. I mean, on a clock. In the hospital, almost died several times. I go in after I had an encounter with Jesus. I went into my neurologist a year later. I hadn't had any seizures. My EKG or EEGs were clear. Everything was good. And he said, man, I don't know what you're doing, but it's working. I said, Jesus healed me. Right. Scientific mind, naturalistic, could not allow for a miracle, but he could not deny the evidence in front of him. That's what eventually converted my dad. My dad thought I was nuts. My dad thought I lost my mind. My dad thought I was in a cult. My dad made fun of me. My dad challenged me. It was not easy for me in the first years after I got saved. First of all, I was an idiot. That didn't help. As John Wayne says, life is hard, and it's even harder when you're stupid. And I was stupid. I didn't know how to operate on it. Nobody, after I got healed, said, this is how you witness. Man, I was just a crazy fanatic. But my dad kept looking. They were the ones taking me to the hospital every 28 days. 28 days went by, no hospital. 28 days went by, no hospital. 28 days went by, no hospital. 28 days, no hospital. And slowly my dad began to say, you know, he would tell other people, he wouldn't tell me, but my brother would report. He'd go around telling people, he said, my son's a little off the deep end, but God healed him. And he began to tell the story. And it began to slowly change how we interacted with each other and what went on with that. And slowly, I mean, before he died, he was in this church, and he would never say it to me, but he'd walk out of this church, and he would tell everybody he was so proud of me, and he was so proud, and he believed. Now, folks, my dad had a slow change, and that's what most people are going to do. But part of what has to change is this worldview that says, where did we come from? We came from God, not from slime. What's wrong with the earth? Let me tell you what's wrong with the planet. We want to be autonomous. We want to do our own thing. That's what's wrong with the world. That's what the first problem was. That's what the problem is today. Is we want to make our own rules. And the challenge is God doesn't have very many rules for us. Really, he basically in the beginning had one rule. Just remember, I make the rules. And we broke that one. That's what's wrong with the earth. And what's the fix? Jesus said it, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Just let him be king again. Let him make the rules. Because every rule he makes is good for us. There's no bad rules. And then finally, what's the destiny? The destiny is there's coming a day where people aren't going to get away with not making him the king. And it's going to be heaven on earth. Now here's the challenge. Whether we have a naturalistic, atheistic worldview or agnostic worldview or deistic worldview, those are the same thing, or a theistic worldview, we all have to be careful of confirmation bias. This is what's happening in America today. What is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias is when we filter what happens or what we hear or what somebody says through our worldview, our set of assumptions, our filter, and we begin to see only what we already see. You with me? I was in the movie theater 2 weeks ago. And this is where I got this message. I said, I got to deal with this. When they were presenting the different views of the Exodus, I heard the groans of Christians when people like David Rawl began to speak. And I wanted to get up and say, everybody shut up and listen to the man. Because folks, if we're not careful, we'll take the theistic worldview and begin to read every event through a theistic worldview, and we can distort what's really happening. How do I know? I've spent 25 years in full-time ministry, people telling me what God did and didn't do. I had one lady tell me once, this years ago, John, you would remember, but she's long gone deceased. She started telling me these stories about angels and things, and she looked at me and said, you don't believe me, do you? Here's what I told her. I said, I don't know whether to believe you or not. I want to find out whether what you're saying really happened. I'm listening. Naturalistic mindset would say, you're crazy, lady. Agnostic worldview would have said, I don't know. Theistic worldview, yeah, let's write the book and sell it and tell everybody. And we're losing discernment. Culture's lost discernment. Christians can lose discernment by not realizing that every event we have goes through a worldview. And here's the problem. Even a theistic worldview is not complete. We're constantly in our lives making adjustments to it as we see things clear. And so I'm not saying get these other two worldviews. I'm saying a theistic worldview is much healthier than these other two worldviews. But I'm saying one of the things that we as Christians have got to start doing as we're relating to other people is stop assuming we got it all right and they got it all wrong. There's things that we got wrong. We just don't see they're wrong. It's like, I don't agree with some of the things I preached 30 years ago. I just can't tell you what that stuff is. As you filter through it, I can't go back 30 years. Let me examine my tape. My theology has changed. I think it's gotten more clear. I think it's better than it was 30 years. When I was first saved, everything was a miracle. I was so boneheaded. My sister got stuck in the mud one day. I've told this story before. Got stuck in the mud. Glory to God, I'll have the strength of Samson to push her out. And my pagan father looked at me like I was an idiot because I was an idiot. He said, here's a rope. Hook it to the car. That was a theistic worldview gone amok. People say, how do you know what you know? I was stupid. I began to liken James. Lord, it says, if you lack wisdom, ask. Could you give me some wisdom? Because I'm going through the school of hard knocks because I lost practical good sense. Because I walked in a church, I experienced a miracle, I had a vision. Jesus didn't appear to me, but He spoke to me in a vision. I go to my deathbed on that one. He healed me. He told me I was healed. They took me in the back room. A half hour later, I had another encounter, went into trance. All doubts were gone. Amazing. And I walked out of that church, and I needed to be locked up for about 3 years. Because I lacked wisdom. I think God looked down at me and said, man, his heart's pure. But Gabriel, go help the boy. And that's when I began to learn wisdom. And so like these three worldviews, if you get a hold of these three worldviews, any book you read, you'll be able to discern by asking the 4 questions. What do they believe about where they came from? I'm reading a book, or studying a book is a better way of saying it, called Emotional Intelligence. I quote it once in a while in sermons, okay? Because it's some great stuff on just what makes people smart. And people are smart in different ways. And so I'm reading through it, and one of the things I've noticed about the book is how many times the guy mentions evolution. It's all over the book. He doesn't need to mention it, but he's mentioned it all the time. It's like another book I read about 10 years ago when I hurt my back. I read a book called, it was about backs. I know the name of the author, and I usually don't know the author. I know the title of the book, but I can't remember what it was. But anyway, this guy kept mentioning evolution too. He kept saying, this is what he kept saying. This is a better example. That's why I'm going to it. He kept saying, in a 1,000 years, evolution will correct this. Wait a minute, we're here by accident. He would say things like, we evolved, and this is why this is going wrong, because we evolved a certain way. But when the body does what it's designed to do, these guys are you catching it? They're confused. Evolution says there is no designer. And the doctor that believes in the worldview that says there is no designer, which would be naturalism, because they're not all atheists, they're just more agnostic, uses terminology like, when the body functions the way it's designed to function, well, if it's doing what it's designed to do, who's the designer? Oh, there is no one. It's called a point of tension. And it's out there all the time. And you're never, and here's the deal about this. When we get into a debate, and I don't encourage you to debate, but discuss things, folks, don't get caught into all the arguments above the level of the worldview. Because if our worldview assumptions are not correct, every argument we build on them comes down. And people say, how do you go into debates? Because I used to love to debate. And how you win a debate is you attack the worldview. What are your assumptions? Where we came from? We either came from a creator or we're here by accident. That was pretty easy for me to debate. Even though all the science says, look, you cut through all the garbage, folks, you're telling me we came from nothing. I've met a few people, it might be true. No, I'm just kidding. That's just illogical. But it's at this worldview level. I don't know if I'm communicating well or not. But we have to beware ourselves of our own confirmation bias. If you want to learn, you really want to learn, you have to know your worldview. You have to have reasons for the answers that you have. And then you have to be willing to listen to people that disagree with you and not be threatened by it. Enough to hear what they say and then challenge their assumptions. And then from time to time, some of the reasons you believe for what you believe are going to be challenged, and you might find that there's things that you misunderstand. But I can tell you what's not changed in my life in the 40 years I've been doing this. The biblical worldview has always withstood the test. The only thing that has changed is how I've understood it and the reasons that I hold for things. And I want to encourage you, don't be afraid to listen to what people are saying, but look for their worldview. When you read a book, like Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, he's got some wonderful things in there that they are finding out with research about intelligence. Did you know that SAT scores do very little to predict the success of people in life? Now, we had a whole generation, some of you young folks wouldn't relate to this as much because they're kind of on to this now. But when I was a kid, everything was about SAT scores and IQ tests. And they're saying now, once you get into college, how many of you have ever gotten a job and the guy said, what was your SAT score? I have had a few bosses ask me what my IQ level is. That's pretty stupid. And what they're finding now is character qualities are more determinant of success in life. Now, if we turn to the Bible, we would have read that. They're catching up. But there's a lot of good information, but there's a lot of worldview in that book. And what I fear, even when I quote a book in the sanctuary, what I fear is people think that I'm sanctioning that book to go read it as something you can trust. I want you to know every book I quote, every article I read, I'm discerning. I just don't have time to do this in every sermon. And so just don't pick up a book. You got to know what their worldview is. And don't get caught up in confirmation bias. Learn to think critically. Critical thinking is not when you criticize the pastor and have roast pastor on Sunday at lunch. You can have all the roast pastor you want. I'd rather you roast me than somebody else. Okay? Because I really don't care. It don't bother me when people roast me. Now, when they roast me to my face, it's a little different story. I'd rather just do it in private. I really don't. Look, if what I said is wrong, prove it to me. I want to grow like you. But critical thinking is not being critical. It's learning to think through what you're hearing. You know, in a healthy church, a church pastor should be equipping people to be able to challenge when I get off course. You should be able to think for yourself. The whole goal of parenting is to teach kids how to be on their own. Isn't that the case? Well, should it be the case? Yeah, I do kind of want our kids to be on their own. That's a joke. Just same way as a pastor. My real goal for everybody who comes to our church is for them to be able to pick up this Bible and get instruction from God without me. I'm just trying to equip you how. As a shepherd, from what I've learned, I'm trying to give you, like, you don't want to go there. And they say, why? Because I went there and it doesn't work. That's what we're doing here. Learning to think. Don't take in anything from anybody just on face value. Think about it, especially if it's important stuff. Let me give you another example of how this works, and then we'll move into the story. We'll have a few minutes, and then we'll start up on this next week. There's a scholar named John Van Cedar. He's in a couple of these other movies that the Patterns of Evidence that I've been watching and studying from. And he says this. Now, he is a theologian teaching, used to teach, I think he's retired now. He was a Canadian scholar of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. He's an expert on the ancient Near East. He's a distinguished professor at the University, or was of North Carolina. Okay? Here's what he says about Moses and the Exodus. He says, the quest for the historical Moses is a futile exercise. What he just said is, trying to look for the real Moses like we've been doing with Joseph, it's pointless. He now belongs only to legend. This is a guy that we pay to send our kids to get trained for ministry. Now, what worldview does he have? You wouldn't know this if you haven't seen the video, but I've seen the video. He was asked in one of the videos, is there a God? His answer was, we don't know. You remember, right? You've seen it. What's his worldview?
Agnostic.
He's agnostic, but he's teaching the Bible. I heard, you would know, everyone in this room would probably know the pastor that I'm about to mention. I'm not going to mention his name because I don't like being critical. I have made a covenant with God that I'm not going to be about being against things. And I'm not going to spend my time correcting other preachers or teachers. But I heard a couple years ago, and I studied this for myself to make sure that I heard what I thought I heard. But this is coming down in evangelicalism, of which we are, who said we need to throw away the Old Testament worldview. Folks, that's dangerous. Because once you throw away the Old Testament worldview, you throw away the entire biblical worldview. Because we're not just theists. My bias, I'm telling you my bias up front. I'm not just a theist. I'm a biblical theist. I believe in God. He's active in the world, and he's outside of whatever's been created, and he's as well as involved within. But I'm also a biblical theist, which my worldview, the answer to those four questions of origins, fall, redemption, and destiny, come from the Bible. And what you'll find in Eastern cultures, like Africa, the reason they are receiving more miracles is faith is a lot easier to them. Because they already believe in a spiritual world that God is involved in. And so the leap to faith is not as big as ours. And so what we have in America and Western world is we're being secularized according to either atheism or agnosticism. And even in our schools of training, we are being taught not to believe in biblical theism. And it's undermining the very faith that we propose to follow. And what gets me aggravated is the average student of the Bible doesn't spend enough time in this stuff to be able to figure this out. And I cry out, where are the shepherds? My job is to be a shepherd. And when it says feed the flock in the Bible, in the New Testament, feed the flock doesn't mean come here for dinner. I'm supposed to teach you biblical truths about God. And I'm supposed to expose. One of the things a shepherd would do is he would go in front of the sheep. And remember in Psalm 23, it says, he prepares a table for me in the presence of my enemy. Anybody remember that? A table isn't a table like this. A table was a grass mesa that was flat, that a shepherd went in front of the sheep and literally pulled out all the poisonous stuff that they would eat so they wouldn't get sick. That's what pastoring is. And there's a lot of stuff out there, folks, that'll make you sick. But the way to be able to discern it is not as complicated as we teachers like to make it. If you get a hold of worldview, where is this person coming from? Are they atheistic, agnostic, or theistic? And then when you figure out if you believe in biblical theism as a worldview, you've got to discern which theistic viewpoint you're going to come from. That's a whole other standpoint, because there's other views about God other than the Bible. So I don't have time to get into that today. So here's what I want to do. I'm not going to have time to read this for you, but I want to give you some homework for those that are really interested in taking this to the next step. In Exodus chapter 14, we read the account of the crossing of the Red Sea. I would like you to read that story in your devotions over the next week. Exodus 14, the whole chapter. All right? And in your notes, I put there's four major things that we have to reconcile in this story. And I even put in your bottom of your notes here, almost like a new frame. Almost like a worldview frame, though it's not a worldview frame. I put this at the end, just to kind of get you to... These are the four things that when you're reading this story, we have to take into accommodation, because even the agnostic David Rawls says the story is based in history. Did he say that? All right. So the four things that frame this story, like a worldview, is there's water, right? The Red Sea. Now there's great debate on what sea that is. And I'm probably not going to get into all that, at least next week, because I'm still working through the different materials that have been presented, because I want to take some time to examine and see who's got the best argument. Okay? But David Rawls' view of the water is that the water is only 10 feet deep. Why? Why does he think it's shallow water?
Because it takes too much wind to do it.
Yeah, his worldview can't explain. How could God part the sea? Okay, with a wind. It says a strong east wind. Read the story. We'll cover the wind in a minute. But the water is going to be separated, and it's going to drown the Egyptians. Then there's wind. There's a strong east wind. What are the four things? There's a wall. And I'm not putting them in the right place. What's the fourth one? Warfare. Those four things, all four of them have to be accommodated when you study this story to get the truth of what's happening. Is the water is going to be heaped up in walls. The text says it's walls. Now, I would encourage those that think that 10 feet of water is shallow. If you take a mile of 10-foot water and separate them with walls, the walls will be pretty high. Okay? But there's at least enough water to drown all the Egyptians. And so, if it was 3 or 4 inches of water, God did a greater miracle, drowning all the Egyptian army in 3 or 4 inches of water. Though I don't think it was that shallow. But one of the things that's going to happen, when I watched the movie a couple weeks ago, one of the things I realized is they did not have time to really expound on the different views. Let me tell you, it would take just as much a miracle to divide. 10 feet of water will stop any group of people. You got women and kids, you can't cross a 10 foot. It's going to take a miracle. Then the other view, which we'll look about next week, because I won't give you any more information, it could be the other place and be a lot deeper. But it doesn't matter. They're both going to take a miracle, because God is at war with the Egyptians. Now, that idea right there blows a lot of people's theology. Miriam, Moses' sister, sings a song of Miriam afterwards, and said, the horse and rider, he's fell into the sea. It's God is a God of war. Now, folks, I can tell you right now, this right here is politically incorrect. Who does God think he is? Making war with people. You know, I'm reading Ravi Zacharias' book again, Jesus Among Secular Gods. He says, it's amazing how violent and mean-spirited people get arguing that there is no God. But once God sets out to do war, boy, he's just evil. They're intolerant of anybody like Christopher Hitchens, of anybody believing in God. Now, I know I'm going on a ledge here, but I'm telling you, these guys are an outright war against God. Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Hawkins and some of these guys. Stephen Hawkins knows now. They're at war with God. There's a place in the Bible that says, you make war with God, He'll make war with you. We don't like that in today's theology because we have a nice God. He's making war. He destroys the whole nation of Egypt. Not because He wanted to, because they wouldn't listen to Him. And He takes them to the Red Sea. You got to accommodate that in the story. I would rather people say, man, I'm having a hard time swallowing that, and deal with that than start changing the nature of God and changing our worldview. Am I making any sense here? You ready to stone me yet? Ready to give me a raise? All right. The wall of water and the wind. He says a strong east wind. It says that, strong east wind. God used natural things supernaturally. So as we go into the story next week, I just wanted to kind of just get the why behind the difference of opinions when it comes to the miracle, particularly the miracle at the Red Sea. Is what we go into it with will either restrict or enhance our ability to see what God's saying. And I think all of us, self-included, maybe even more than anyone else here tonight, has to constantly overcome some of the stuff we bring into the Bible stories with us. None of us read the stories with pure eyes. And so one of the things we can begin to accommodate and look at is our worldview. A worldview answers 4 questions. Where do we come from? What went wrong with the earth, or what's wrong with the earth? It's the reason why, in the last 2 weeks we've had here in our church, we've had a number of serious health issues. I mean serious. I'm not talking about a hangnail. It has been, hasn't it, John? It has been a rough 2 to 3 weeks. After you go through 2-3 weeks like that, you begin to ask, what's wrong with the world? You want to find out how the world is? Go to AI DuPont and spend the day there. You're going to ask, what's wrong with the earth? What's wrong with the world? Why is there suffering? And suffering is one of the biggest reasons why people don't want to believe in God. You got to answer. The Bible addresses it head on. It does not skirt the issue. Then the third one is redemption. Well, if there's something wrong with the earth, what's the fix? What's the fix? Everybody's got a fix. The Democrats have a fix. The Republicans have a fix. When you vote for a politician, they have a worldview. They have a belief about what's going to fix the problem. I'm not hearing any of them getting up and saying totally the right things. Like, we're sinners that need salvation. We want to be autonomous, so we need to repent. Ain't nobody saying that. So don't get mad at me whether you're Democrat or Republican. Everybody get mad at me. And the final was, where are we going? Is this all there is? Even the Bible says, the Apostle Paul said, if this is all there is, then eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. He said, if I have just Christ in this life, fought with the beasts of Ephesus, we're of men most miserable. Folks, this isn't all there is. There is a God. He's involved in this earth. He's involved in this universe, and He's outside of this universe. I can't give you a whole lot of explanation about that. I just know He was here before it was made, and if the universe has edges, He's the one that made them. But He's also involved in your, and He's taking the universe, and He's taking us somewhere. Pay attention to your worldview. Okay? Now we have 5 minutes before the kids come out, I think. Is there any question, anything I need to clean up? Because that's pretty deep. This stuff will change everything you see in life. Morning, Steve. Steve is a doctor. He teaches at the university level. He'll tell you this is right where we are, isn't it, Steve? Yep. Get a hold of this. Pay attention to your worldview, what you believe and why. Don't be afraid to let it be challenged. If you have the truth, it will stand an objective test. If you don't have the truth, and it doesn't stand an objective test, ask yourself why. What's wrong with what I'm saying? About 7 or 8 years ago, I did this with my eschatology. I could not reconcile what I was reading in books with the Bible. And I said, and it took me several years to make a fundamental shift in my view of eschatology. And it was hard. But it was like, this group just not answers the questions that I raised. And I still have questions. But this way I'm looking at it right now answers more questions than that one. And maybe down the road I'll have to move a little bit more. That's called learning. All right, any questions? No? Everybody says, I want to get out of here before Pastor Bob gets started again. So what you took out of this tonight is when Pastor Bob was young, he was stupid. That's all I'll hear on Facebook. And guess what? At 57, he ain't the brightest in the room. It's okay. All right, well, you can go pick up your kids. Next week we're going to start taking a look at Moses.